The departure monitors at O'Hare flickered like dying stars, casting a cold digital glow over a boy, whose only inheritance was a wooden box of weighted carvings and a non-refundable dream. Silas didn't realize that in the eyes of the velvet rope elite, a genius in a thrift store coat is indistinguishable from a ghost. The air inside Terminal 3 tasted of jet fuel, and the sterile, over-expensive cologne of men who never had to check their bank balances before ordering a double espresso. At 19, Silas Vance was a study in contradictions. He possessed the focused, predatory stillness of a grandmaster and the frantic, wide-eyed pulse of a kid who had never stepped foot outside the Midwest. In his steady right hand, he gripped a first-class boarding pass to London, a document that felt less like paper and more like a golden ticket to a life he hadn't yet earned, gifted by a father who had worked double shifts at the foundry for 3 years. To buy it, he was 3 paces from the mahogany-clad podium of Gate C-14. When the atmosphere curdled, behind the counter stood a woman who seemed carved from high-grade industrial plastic. Her name tag read Vance. An irony that Silas found more bruising than humorous. She didn't look at his ticket. She looked at the scuff on his left shoe and the way his backpack straps were frayed at the seams. Beside her, a younger man with a smile as sharp and empty as a razor blade leaned against the terminal wall, watching Silas with the bored detachment of a Roman guard. "Wrong line, sweetheart," the woman said. Her voice had the tonal quality of a fingernail dragging across a chalkboard. "Coach begins boarding in 20 minutes at the far end of the terminal. You're obstructing the priority flow." Silas swallowed his throat dry. "I'm on this flight seat 3A. He extended the paper, trembling slightly. The woman, whom the younger guard addressed as Evelyn, didn't reach for it. Instead, she leaned back, crossing her arms over a crisp navy blazer. 3A is a legacy suite, kid. It's reserved for patrons of the arts and corporate officers. It is not for runaways with library cards. Now move along before you become a security incident." "It's not a mistake," Silas insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "I'm playing in the Invitational. I'm a ranked player, my father. He bought this for my graduation." The younger man let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Your father bought a transatlantic premier suite. What's he do, mine? Diamonds in his backyard. Look at you. You don't have the aesthetic for this cabin. You're a statistical impossibility." "The ticket is valid," Silas said, his face burning. "Scan it, please." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, concentrated condescension. "I don't need a machine to tell me when I'm being played. This is a curated experience. We provide a sanctuary for the world's elite, and your presence is a pollutant. You've likely stolen this. Or perhaps you're part of some social media stunt. Regardless, you are barred from this gate." She picked up a black receiver and spoke into it. Without breaking eye contact with Silas. "Security to C-14, we have a transient attempting to breach the Premier Lounge with fraudulent documentation." Level 2 escalation. The world seemed to tilt. Silas backed away, the rhythmic thump of his heart drowning out the overhead announcements. He retreated to a row of hard plastic chairs, sinking into a corner where the shadows were deepest. He felt small, not just young, but microscopic. The board was set, and he had been checkmated before he could even move a pawn. Nearby, a man sat unnoticed. He wore a heavy wool overcoat and a flat cap pulled low over his brow, a thick financial ledger resting on his knee. To anyone passing by, he looked like a retired professor, or perhaps a weary traveler waiting for a delayed connection. In reality, he was Julian Vane, the architect of the very airline whose logo adorned the walls. Julian lived by a singular obsessive code. A brand is a promise made to a stranger. He traveled under various aliases to see if his staff kept those promises when they thought no one of consequence was watching. Julian closed his ledger. He had seen the entire exchange. The sneer on Evelyn's face, the trembling of the boy's hands, and the casual cruelty of the gate guard. He stood and walked over to Silas, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "That's a heavy burden for a young man to carry alone," Julian said, nodding toward the backpack. Silas looked up, his eyes glassy. "They wouldn't even check my name. They saw what I didn't have." "May I examine the cause of the commotion?" Julian asked, gesturing toward the ticket. Silas handed it over. With the numbness of a man who had already lost everything, Julian looked at the seat number, then at the name Silas Vance. He remembered a headline from the previous about a prodigy from the South Side who had cleared the national qualifiers. "Stand up, Silas," Julian commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order issued with the weight of a sovereign. "I can't. The police are coming." "Good." Julian replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I've always found that the law works best when the evidence is undeniable." They walked back to the podium. Evelyn's face twisted into a mask of pure irritation when she saw Silas returning with a companion. "I told you to clear the area, and you," she pointed a sharp finger at Julian, "are now complicit in a terminal disturbance. Security is 30 seconds away." Julian didn't flinch. He placed his own boarding pass. "Seat 1A on the counter next to Silas." "My name is Julian," he said quietly, "and I find your interpretation of priority flow to be profoundly flawed. Scan the boy's ticket." Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on the counter. "Listen, Pops. We have a profile of excellence at this airline. This kid is a blemish on that profile. He's staying on the ground. You want to join him? Keep talking. The profile of excellence. Julian's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a cold, lethal authority. Who drafted that? Because I don't remember. Authorizing a policy that permits staff to play judge and jury based on the quality of a passenger's luggage. You don't know how the world works. Old man Evelyn snapped. The officers are here. You're both finished. 2 armed airport police officers converged on the gate. Evelyn pointed a manicured finger at Silas. That one fraud and harassment. Take him down to processing. Julian reached into his interior pocket and withdrew a small obsidian card with a silver phoenix embossed in the center. He didn't show it to the officers. He held it directly in front of Evelyn's eyes. The silence that followed was absolute. The color fled from Evelyn's cheeks, leaving her looking like a wax figure left too close to a flame. That's the chairman's seal. She whispered, her voice cracking. Read the name on the account. Evelyn Julian said, Julian Vane. She breathed the officers, recognizing the man who essentially owned the ground they stood on. Immediately went to parade rest. Marcus looked as though he were trying to physically shrink into the drywall. I built this company on the idea that travel is the great equalizer, Julian said, his voice carrying to every passenger in the lounge. I spent 4 decades ensuring that every person who holds a Vane air ticket is treated with the dignity of a king. In 10 minutes you have dismantled that legacy. You didn't protect the brand. You parasitized it. You used your position not to serve, but to feel superior to a boy who has more talent in his pinky finger than you have in your entire career. Mr. Vane, please. Evelyn stammered, her hands shaking. I was maintaining the atmosphere. You are the atmosphere. Julian cut her off. And right now it's toxic. You and Mr. Thorne are relieved of duty. Leave your credentials on the desk. You will not be escorted to the exit. You will be escorted to the precinct, where my legal team will be filing a formal suit for breach of contract and discriminatory practice. As the officers LED the 2 former employees away, now replaced by looks of sheer naked terror. A wave of applause broke out among the waiting passengers. Julian turned to Silas, took the boy's ticket and fed it into the scanner himself. The machine gave a triumphant melodic chime. The board is open, Silas. Julian said, make your move. The flight to London was a masterclass in the life. Silas had only imagined he sat in 3A, the leather of the seat smelling of high-end craftsmanship. While Julian sat across the aisle, they spent the next 8 hours not discussing money. But logic, Julian was captivated by how Silas analyzed the world, not as a series of obstacles, but as a sequence of potential outcomes. By the time the wheels touched down at Heathrow, Julian hadn't just found a passenger, he had found a protege. But while Silas's world was expanding, Evelyn's was collapsing into a black hole. Within 24 hours, a passenger's recording of the encounter had reached 40 million views. She became a global pariah, a living symbol of elitist cruelty. She was unhireable. No firm wanted the gatekeeper of C-14 anywhere near their customer service. Her husband, a man whose social climbing was his only hobby, filed for divorce within the week. To distance himself from the scandal, Evelyn attempted a desperate wrongful termination suit. But the discovery process was her undoing. Julian's investigators found a digital trail of messages between her and Marcus where they joked about bumping the peasants. To make room for their own family members and friends, the judge didn't just throw the case out. He slapped Evelyn with a massive fine for frivolous litigation. She ended up losing her home, eventually taking a cleaning the very terminal floor she once walked upon. With such arrogance, working the night shift where no one would recognize her. 5 years later, Silas Vance stood in the boardroom of Vane Global. He was the youngest chief strategy officer in the history of aviation. He was currently finalizing the Legacy Ascent program, a foundation that provided international travel for students from low-income districts. The board is worried about the margins, Silas Julian said, looking out at the Chicago skyline from the 80th floor. Why are we spending so much on ground-level sensitivity training? Silas looked at a small wooden chess piece on his desk, a humble pawn that had been promoted to a queen. Because, Julian, a kingdom isn't defined by its palace. It's defined by who it lets through the gate. If the gatekeepers are rot, the crown is meaningless. I want to make sure that the next kid with a dream doesn't have to wait for the chairman just to get on a plane, Julian smiled, leaning back, checkmate. As Silas left for the evening, he walked through Terminal 3. He passed a woman in a gray janitorial uniform, scrubbing the base of a podium. She didn't look up, her spirit broken by years of anonymity and toil. Silas didn't stop to gloat. He didn't even slow down. He had realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing her fail. It was becoming so significant that her existence no longer mattered to his game. He walked toward his flight, a man who knew that true power wasn't about the doors you could close, but the horizons you could open. I've transformed the core conflict into a narrative, merit versus status, ensuring the prose is entirely original and free from the specific clothing-based tropes of the source.